Right. Good evening, Syracuse. This is Dr. Ellen White with Syracuse Reads Plus, and we are here again having community talks about the importance of literacy. Tonight we have a special guest, Mr. Ismael Jimenez from Philadelphia. And before he jumps in and talks to us about the history of literacy for Blacks in the United States, I will review our mission and vision for our work here in Syracuse. So, welcome to Syracuse Reads Plus. Remember that our goal is to be reading great as a community by 2028. Again, I am Dr. Katrina Allen White, one of the co founders of Syracuse Reads Plus and the CEO of our grassroots organization. Our mission is to empower all Syracuse residents to assist with growing one another, our community members of all ages, in literacy. And our purpose is to strive to support our citizens of Syracuse and their families by empowering everyone, especially our neighbors and all of our youth, to read better, improve their literacy strategies, including their math abilities, so that they too can graduate from high school, pursue post secondary goals, and improve their ability to read, write, and comprehend. So why do we do this work? We do this work because 8 out of our 10 youth in Syracuse need help with their reading skills so that they can become better readers and mathematicians. And because students who aren't reading on grade level by fourth grade are less likely to graduate from high school. Also, we have approximately 60,000 adults in Onondaga County, according to the last census, who also struggle to read. And so the more likely, if you have low literacy skills, you're more likely to be impoverished, incarcerated, or commit violent crimes towards others. So that's why we do this work. That's why we have important guests like Mr. Jimenez join us so we can continue the conversation because we believe that people like you can make a positive impact on our community through literacy. So, the history of literacy for Blacks in the US. Welcome, welcome, welcome. And thank you for joining me. Ismael, how are you doing today?
Doing lovely. Very glad to be here.
So we met because I saw you speaking about the history of literacy for Blacks in the U.S. for an organization in Philadelphia. So do you want to tell us about that organization and then tell us about the work that you do in public education and at the college level?
Well, yes. Well, Read by Fourth is an organization in the city of Philadelphia that strives to kind of encourage the goal of having all children kind of reading at proficient by fourth grade in Philadelphia. And they do this by getting like almost like block captains, but almost like folks that are dedicated, like retired retirees and other folks that might have free time to volunteer their time to read to children to kind of build that muscle and also includes obviously book giveaways and other things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, I am the director of social studies for the School District of Philadelphia, and I also uh, side hustle at the University of Pennsylvania in the graduate program. So right now, that's really what my focus is, even though the views that I'm going to espouse today do not reflect the views of my employers. I definitely got to say that. And the
Right.
views are all my own.
I think that's an important plug. And the same applies to myself.
Yes.
So I do want to ask you, why is literacy important to you before we get started with your presentation?
Um, well, I definitely, since a young child, had a love for literacy. It's not only was a way to imagine something different, but also kind of deal with the everyday issues in which you are facing. It helps you analyze it and be more critical on what you see, right?
Mhm.
Believe none of what you see and half of what you hear. And taking that time out to actually read and that patience and everything that goes along with that endeavor, it kind of builds the muscle of your brain, right? And
Right.
like every other muscle, if you don't work it out, man, it's going to get flabby. So you got to work out that muscle. And reading is definitely just like one of those tools to get you there in a way where you can really like think about yourself, think about the world, and think about how to navigate situations in real time
Right. And to communicate, right?
and
So
communicate, definitely to communicate.
to have the right words to share with others and to be able to receive them.
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Mhm.
I want to make sure that you can share.
Okay. Oop, boom. Um, the way I wanted to approach this evening is emphasize we're not creating something new, right? These are important lessons that we need to take with us, especially in our current situation. But I'm definitely going to spend time contextualizing what I see the current situation in education to be. With that being said, if you're interested right now on the bottom right hand of your screen is a QR code. If you scan that QR code, it will allow you to have access to this PowerPoint for future reference, which I strongly suggest because there's great resources at the end of this to really delve deeper into this conversation if you want to, and even read more about it. So I subtitled this Unlearning for Liberation Through the Black Intellectual Tradition. And I hope to really go over some history and some examples to really like feed into the idea that there's a long intellectual genealogy of thinkers and folks who spent time kind of creating an infrastructure around what it meant to be educated in a society that didn't want you educated. And if they did want you educated, it was only in the ways in which they want you to do. And we're actually going to talk about has that changed? So, enough previewing here. Throughout the session, I love quotes, so you're going to see this a lot. But I'm going to start us off just kind of thinking, when we think about what the purpose of education is, right? Why are we doing what we're doing, or why it's important to read and think and have our children to be able to grow up and in what ways, right? And this Jacob Carruthers quote, I think, speaks really deeply to this for me. Education is the instruction of those who do not know about the speeches and the wisdoms of the ancestors. Instruction is a process of teaching good speech through good speaking. The individual educated through good speech becomes a good speaker, right? So, how are we socializing our children into reading, into appreciating being literate? I'm happy folks think about that. But first, I just want to say, introduce myself again. My name is Ismael Jimenez. This is my 16th year with the School District of Philadelphia, 12 years as a teacher in the classroom. My first four at a high school that was closed, along with 23 others across the city of Philadelphia in 2013. And then I found myself in Kensington teaching there up until I uh, came to central office, and I just started my third year as director of social studies for the school district of Philadelphia. For the past 4 years, I also have been an adjunct professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Uh, I have four sons, those are my boys right there, outside a black-owned bookstore in Phoenix, which is a strange thing. So I just always have to share that. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful bookstore, grassroots books. Just shout out for them. I'm a proud husband, father of four boys. I believe education is the practice of freedom. And a fun fact, I graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA. And I point that out because I loved reading. I loved engaging in the world. But schooling at the same time became a barrier to actually truly authentically engaging in that. And the only way to reconcile that at times, unfortunately, was to educate on my own while simultaneously just doing enough to graduate high school, which is nothing I would encourage anybody to do. It's a longer route. Again, I want to say the views and perspectives that I will be sharing do not reflect the views of the School District of Philadelphia. This presentation is grounded in scholarship, educational practice, and historical context, right? I'm trying to really, bring some real thought and reflection when we talk about this history. I always have norms, just because when you think about these ideas, when you talk about your neighbors, I just want to model that for folks to understand that it's very important to kind of norm the situation when you have a conversation. And one of the things I definitely want to emphasize with this one is expect non-closure. I probably made too many slides to actually get through this, but I definitely appreciate people's time listening right now. These are the session's objectives, recognize historical and current barriers that perpetuate racialized inequality, develop strategies to counter systematic barriers, leave alone actionable tools and personal commitment, uh, pursue through transformation through education. So I know these are lofty goals, expect non-closure. Um, so I always like to start us off just with a quote to think about. We did with the Jacob Carruthers, but we got to think about in the context of educators, whether you're in the formal educational space or if you're in the educational space non-formally, but you're engaged with it with the youth. I think this is kind of speaking to kind of institutions and systems and structures that we find ourselves operating in. So when I read this quote, I want folks to think about what is the significance of the meaning of quote in relation to the realities of traditional education? And can a person be an effective educator without taking in considerations what this quote is talking about? So here we go. Any educators unwilling to use their position on behalf of those who have been marginalized, oppressed, and dispossessed is not worthy of their position. Any educator more concerned with job security than with the lives of their students, families, and our collective humanity is a self-serving educator. Any educator who prioritizes temporary compliance rather than challenging the oppression embedded in schools and school system is merely reproducing our inequitable, unjust society. Dr. Kamika Royal. And I just don't use her because she's from Philadelphia and all that. Um, Dr. Kamika Royal has wrote one of the best books about the history of Philadelphia schools called Not Paid for Us, and really the role of Philadelphia schools with the Black community. And I think this speaks to kind of our responsibility as educators, regardless of your racial identity, to really take responsibility for the situation that we find ourselves in. So, back to the original question, and I didn't get into it at the time about how like why reading and literacy is so important to me. But um, when I was a young child, I used to just go to the library. If it had a pretty cover, I would read it. Those type of stories. I like those fiction stories just with nice covers and goosebumps and all that. But in fourth grade, I had an incident. I was going to a mostly white school in the suburbs, and I had a stuttering problem. And I wouldn't say problem, stuttering issue. And with that issue, one day in class, I rose my hand to answer a question and started stuttering. And the class started laughing at me. And the teacher's like, don't mind him, his people talk like that. And that was in fourth grade. So go home, tell my parents my father is Puerto Rican and Dominican, but I call myself Ismael Jimenez because that's what he called himself. That wasn't part of his, the Hispanic identity wasn't in the house. And then my mother was a Black woman from England. So when I go home, tell them, of course, the outrage, contact the school, the teacher apologizes eventually. Um, but a week later, in the library, just checking out books. The librarian, this older Jewish lady, said to me, "Oh, I heard what happened to you. That's horrible. There's nothing wrong with who you are." She's like, "You ever heard of Malcolm X?" I'm like, "No." And she's like, and she gave me her original copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X in fourth grade. And with that, that began my passion to read and love. I read Susan B. Anthony biography after that. I started reading all these things. Um, And although I didn't graduate high school with a 1.6 GPA, I was thoroughly engaged in all these types of texts from a young age, things that I didn't learn about. And I say this to the side, like I didn't even learn about James Baldwin until I was 27 years old, just to put that in comparison to already being engaged in this type of thinking at this age. But what are the empowerments to even getting this education? I think Dr. Bettina Love called it spirit murdering, right? That issue that happened to me in fourth grade, if that librarian didn't give me that book, would I be who I am today? Would I have been able to make sense out of the other bumps in the roads and the racialization in certain communities that I experienced? And unfortunately, this happens no matter what community in within this society. And not blaming any individual, but more as a structural way of how this society has developed. But what are these barriers to education? Um, Historical amnesia, right? The systematic erasure of Black participation in the development of civilization. It's like, come on, y'all, we still have movies about ancient Egypt, and the only Black people are slaves. You know what I mean? And it's like try to make sense out of that. And all the kings and queens have British accents, but I digress. A dependency on Eurocentric constructs, right? This leads to kind of this idea of conceptual incarceration, this idea of being limited within the constructs of what we define, being imposed by us, being defined, right? Of what reality and what measures of what our value system should be all about. And hopefully that's not too deep for folks, but like what informs how we view and what we view the world as being and the purpose of, right? And then fragmentation of identity, right? A lot of the times, if we don't have these hard conversations about a very racialized society in which we exist in, regardless of the racial or ethnic identity of you or the youth, how much are we actually engaging in that in the real world and practicing that in real ways, right? And it's very important to model that because even a child before they're even the age of 5 understands the idea of race. And that's nothing I wish anybody had to have imposed upon them from a construct of a society that has delineated certain characteristics and stereotypes associated. But that internalization is what Dr. Bobby Wright called menticide. And just like homicide, suicide, and all the sides, it's the destruction of the mind where reading becomes, oh, I don't do that. You don't listen to the lessons that we need to listen to in order to move forward. And of course, we're dealing with consolidation of the media manipulation, and educational indoctrination. To this day, I don't know why people are so worried about what's happening in classrooms, because in reality, were those conversations even happening to begin with? And just because they started to happen in some scale does not mean that was on the scale of anything that this society needs to reconcile in order to even have a conversation to move forward. So those are kind of barriers to this kind of idea of educational empowerment. And people always point to, oh, well, racism, Martin Luther King and all them, they march, it's over, da da da. But we also see those things manifest in the present, right? Continued discrimination in housing access, increased wealth gap between whites and blacks, which is still steadily increasing. Dog whistle politics used by politicians. Shoot, we got politicians using bullhorns now, but we still have folks that engage in that racialized language where black and brown people are part of the conversation, yet not part of the conversation, if you know what I mean. Achievement gap over testing, emphasis on testing as the sole metric of academic success. Instead of looking at the holistic situation, we look at things in boxes. And as a consequence, we keep on hitting our head on to really understand that we're asking students to read the world and read the word at the same time to understand a deeper thing about what it means to be who they are. And then, of course, school funding disparities and this consistent in every state across state lines, county lines. When you find more Black and brown children, you tend to find less funding for schools and other initiatives that need to be happening in order to to do well. And these are things that still exist today. And if you took uh, the QR code at the beginning for this slide deck, each one of these has a viable article describing what each things are in real time. Again, I told you I love quotes. And if you don't know Dr. Baba Asa Hillard, I strongly suggest you read him around education, around his thinking around education. Um, and then ask yourself, if you went to school for education, why did you never hear about him? But that's a whole nother separate conversation. The list of the destructive nature of white supremacy goes on, and teachers are bound ethically to study white supremacy in the schooling process. And I know I'm really emphasizing school, but really most of our children are in school at 2 hour, 3 hour blocks of English language arts classes, getting drilled in many of the schools that our children attend. And then what way are they deconstructing what they're reading and putting in with context and what matters and relevant to their existence? Or is it placed in buckets outside of what's relevant to what's important to them and even trying to navigate and understand the world in which we find ourselves in? So I want to show this brief video, and I think this is going to be powerful. It just shows you kind of wrapping up this contextualization of what we're dealing with.
Days is one of them. When you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it.
They took the chains off of us physically, but mentally, they there all day. They there all day.
I don't know anything, hardly anything about my culture. You can ask me and I can barely tell you because I really don't know because they didn't teach me much. They didn't teach my friends much.
I don't know, yo.
When you ask a young person today who they are, they'll tell you they don't know. I see this every day. I've been teaching for the last 4 years, and I see these things, and they wonder why a young person would actually pick the white dowel over the black dowel in the dowel test.
A Girl Like Me was done by Carrie Davis. At the time she did the film, she was only 14 years old. And what Carrie did so brilliantly, she replicated Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark's experiments in the early 1950s, showing the damage of racism.
When I was in middle school, we were studying the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation case, and my teacher mentioned something about this doll test, where Black children preferred a white doll. And I always kind of wondered, like, what if we were to do that experiment again? Like, have we really progressed that much in over 50 years? Show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with. That one? It basically helped me just realize what's being valued today. And even though these children are 4 and 5 years old, they still know what America values. And when it comes down to it, they know it's not them. And can you show me the doll that looks bad? And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll? He's white.
Oof. I'm going to stop there. You can definitely watch the whole video if you hit the QR code, and I could probably show that again before the end of my presentation. But we got to think about what's being showed. And again, I'm going to keep on coming back to this idea. It doesn't matter what racial identity or ethnic identity you are. I don't care if you're pink with purple polka dots. The condition and the situation that's described, all of us suffer from not knowing these histories. And that's a way to start, right? To question why we know the things we know and why don't we know certain other things. And again, that's where the Black intellectual tradition can really move forward. But I ask, how are the children? And we have to be honest about the situation that we're facing. So I really want folks to sit back and reflect about this question and this idea. How are the children? And then what happens to a person who is taught to forget their past, distrust their present? What happens to their future? And see, when we're dealing with the situation of always living in the present, right? And don't know the stories that inform from us the past, the lessons that we learn, what are we actually using? What are we relying upon to inform what we're dealing with? And how to deal with what is actually in reality, right? Because it can be confusing. And I want to highlight what we are dealing with. And this is the idea of a rhetorical ethic, right? And it's a statement framed in terms of acceptable moral behaviors towards others that meant for rhetorical purposes only, right? And we can name, I list some of the examples: No Child Left Behind, Every Student Succeeds Act, right? These languages were used, but then still at the same time, they penalize folks who are struggling the most under those situations, under those conditions and the definitions of what was supposed to be done. The justice system, right? When we say the justice system, all we got to do is point to the statistics and we'll see that. Equal opportunity, urban education, right? These languages are used in different ways. And if you've ever read Orwell's 1984, you know what I'm talking about. And again, see how books can illuminate these realities? But we're not teaching to survive. We're learning to restore, right? So we need to step away from this idea of being compliance focused, right? Especially when it comes to asking our children to read, right? We got to have, and adults to read, right? Because adults also are really struggling with literacy. Uh, it's to purpose, right? We need to stop teaching it as individual success and have like a deeper meaning, a collective purpose about why we're engaging in these texts, right? What's the purpose of taking my time out when I can just like scroll on my screen, right? To take time to actually have a read and then engage with others about what you think about what you read together. And see, this is the power of it, right? And we need to step away from this test prep and control and healing and connection. And again, that comes with that collaborative learning community that you establish again, formally or non-formally. But then I ask you, where do you see this approach in education? Any of these? What practices do we do that reinforce these or reinforce these? Because our national context, book bans, those things aren't going away, y'all, still happening. We also have state laws, right? Restricting race and injustice in over 40 states. Even a federal government withholding funds, claiming cities like Chicago, schools engage in a Black male-focused program that they consider DEI and offensive and therefore breaking of the law. These are things of what we're dealing with now. Literacy is being narrowed to a technical skill, stripped of critical thought, and engaging with the moral complexity of a lot of the stories that we engage in, right? Whether fiction or nonfictions. And then also all this reflects a long-standing way how this society has treated education, especially when it comes to Black and brown folks within the society, and what the role of education should be in people's lives. But I ask and I hope that we're not a day late and a dollar short, right? Where we see rumors of war everywhere, where we see inequality rise, and when we see, uh, existential environmental issues, global arms races, right? These are things that are really reality that our children are coming into, and they need to help make sense out of the world that they're going to inherit. That's easier said than done, ain't it? Derek Bell, this brother right here, considered the father of critical race theory. Um, if you don't know who he is, please Google him. Please, please. The human tendency to hope for a better day rather than to work and run risks for it is particularly strong when a confrontation with those in authority would endanger one's physical safety or economic well-being. I mean, that's just a fact. But when we talk about these larger issues and the realities in which we got to deal with, it's going to take courageous individuals from multiple angles to really tackle the problem. And believe me, literacy is going to lay at the foundation of any true type of transformational movement when it comes to education, when it comes to our society at large, not to make it too grandiose. Um, and one thing I want to point out, and one idea, if folks aren't familiar with it, is the idea of the African-centered worldview. And when we talk about this, it's a more of a cyclical understanding of how history works and the world works. The past, present, and the future somewhat exists at the same time, right? There's an idea of more of collective responsibility for one another. Oneself is complementary to others, right? These type of ideas informed a lot of folks' understanding and worldview. And I really want to point out how this can inform when we think about literacy and when we think about time, right? Because time is entwined with political and psychological currents of the moment. And we must recognize the specific temporal dynamics at play and act with awareness that the president is indeed at a critical juncture for meaningful change. So the past, present, and the future simultaneously exist at the same time. If you're familiar with Schrodinger's cat, right? They scientifically can prove that right now, but our ancestors and indigenous folks across the world knew this truth to be true. So what are we creating right now with that would set the foundation to create a more literate condition for our children? And I just want to point to three pillars around education. Lucy Craft Laney founded the first school for Black children in Augusta, Georgia. And not only did she found the school, but she was also kind of like the guiding light for Charlotte Brown Hawkins, Mary Bethune, and then also Helens Burroughs. And so she laid that foundation, which laid their foundation to who we can still speak to, generations that have benefited from what was structured by Lucy Craft Laney at that point in Augustus, Georgia, right after the end of enslavement. Carter G. Woodson took it a little farther in the sense of thinking about history and the importance of understanding history in order to even be literate. And he became one of the first scholars to actually make that, the first to get a PhD in history from Harvard, but that's not that important. It's more important that he was the first Black person of enslaved people in America. He was a child of enslaved people to get a doctorate, which is significant if you didn't know that. But Carter G. Woodson, Black History Month, all these type of things. If you didn't know, he's the father of Black history. And he started Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. Ask yourself why isn't he talked about during Black History Month? And then, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived over 9 decades from NAACP, from Souls of Black Folks. That was 1903, y'all. He lived until the eve of the March on Washington in 1963. And in Ghana, he passed away. So, like, you got to think of that long time of him thinking about these issues and what he wrote about and what he talked about. But Black education has always been political. moving from literacy as control to literacy as defiance to literacy as the sign of a liberated future. And when I say that, when we talk about the history of literacy for Black folks in America, and during the enslavement period, people went out their way, enslaved people, regardless of the trouble they received, getting their fingers cut. They even had laws on the books against reading. People still went out their way to teach each other how to read on the dirt in the back of the woods at night, and other ways of really engaging in that type of fugitivity of learning. But also, there was also examples of British colonial society starting something called the Bray schools, where they would actually argue that education could be used a way to teach enslaved folks to behave and be more moral and understand the Bible. And this was also another form of the first form of like education that was financed, right, by the establishment, by the powers that be, to educate Black people. And its sole purpose was to kind of like keep them docile, keep them in their place. But then you also have examples of people who went to Brave schools and used them as ways to really build up the community around them, like Absalom Jones in Philadelphia, which had the second Black congregation, all Black congregation in the country. So when we're talking about this from moving literacy control, already you're seeing at the beginning this you can't engage, or you engage in the ways in which I define it. At the end of enslavement, you see a huge burst of folks wanting to educate and educate themselves. As the Freedmen's Bureau and troops came in to certain areas in the back areas of South Carolina, they already found established areas where folks were teaching each other in almost a school type situation, the children about the world and everything about what's happening, and even like, the domestic stuff around the around the house and everything. So like we got to keep in mind that like education is a socialization process, how we socializing our children. So you see that as an example, and you see folks even donate schools, sharecroppers, giving all the pennies, all the monies that they had to help finance schools, so-called Rosenwald schools, where Rosenwald donated $500. And those schools were sprouted all over the South. But you got to remember that this was an endeavor that people went out their way to make sure that there was a schoolhouse accessible to their children, that they had the ability, and there was a constant struggle to make sure that was happening. As schools became more formalized, and then you start to see Jim Crow schools very clearly, you start to see that not only the disparity in resources, but then you start to see a tight knit community be developed within those schools, where education was still going on about how to navigate white society without white society being aware of what that was actually happening within the classroom, where teachers would teach about things they weren't supposed to teach about their history to the students, and then the students knew when and where appropriate to talk about those things, and when to pretend if people come in to inspect, right? But then you got to think, why would people come in to inspect? And again, this comes to, you can get educated, but you need to get educated in the way we think you need to be educated. And here's the curriculum in which we give you. And we can just fast forward today, and we see these kind of modes of ways of thinking of education still today. You can talk about that, but you can't talk about it in this way. Or you can't say that, you can't say these words, you can't read these books, you can't have students thinking or talking about these thoughts, right? But again, there's a long intellectual genealogy of educators, Black educators in this society, in this country, that folks can find a model of and learn from, that engaged in this type of fugitivity of thinking and educating and exposing students and each other to literacy. James Cone, man, I told you I love quotes. The Black community must reclaim its history by unraveling new meanings in old tales so the past may emerge as an instrument of Black liberation. But what is fugitivity? I use this idea if you're familiar with Dr. Jarvis Given's book, Fugitive Pedagogy, The Art of Black Teaching, Carter G. Woodson. But he uses the idea of fugitivity as refusal, resistance, right? People engaging in reading and learning, they're engaging in resistance and refusal to a system that says, oh, you can't learn that, or you can't learn at all. And then in education, it signals how folks can disrupt oppressive and create liberatory spaces. So just because you find yourself in institutions, there's no reasons why you can't create crawl spaces where folks can engage in this real conversation about the world and reading and thinking about this at the same time. So what is it? Refusal of domination, concealed acts of resistance, double consciousness in practice, pedagogical maroonage. I love that. Pedagogical maroonage. I'm gonna let that marinate for a second. If folks know what maroonage is, and then pedagogical, right? What are we talking about? Historical memory as resistance, protection of the vulnerable, imaginative freedom, living in but not of the institution. And I have some reflection questions up there. I really wish I can engage folks on this level, but I definitely encourage folks to think about these in relation. But it's not simply about flight, it's about alternative ways of knowing and teaching, methods born out of the necessity to protect truth, identity, and possibility. And just to bring it back to this maroon in spirit, it's the resistance, the self-reliance, the preservation of culture. It's the liberation and educational practice. It's understanding that engaging in it is a part of life. Reading, engaging with the world, right? It's not just something that is out there that people do. You are unable to, read the world at an illiterate stage. So when we're talking about maroonage, it's kind of understanding like, are you not supposed to read? Why is that? Like, why were you never introduced to these things? So how does it connect? It's rooted in the act of refusing dominant ways of knowing. Black intellectuals long only resisted Western institutionalized or state-sanctioned knowledge as valid. And this goes back to the idea of thinking outside of the conceptual incarceration that unfortunately a lot of the definitions that we're forced to speak with, right, even speaking the language or reading in one language and not in others, right, informs how we see the world, even our positionality. So when we're talking about this refusal, where we're talking about a refusal of a certain way of knowing as the only way of knowing, that there can be several contradictory things that exist at once. And believe me, when you get into that type of reading, that's next level. Teaching as political and spiritual work, right? This is something that has a long tradition of folks who engage in this type of practice of engaging youth and actually learning. Because I don't care what your title is, you're a teacher, you're an educator. Maroonage as a metaphor, radical hope and future building. And of course, I give you some thinkers to think about. So if you got this slide deck, I strongly suggest if you don't know these folks, Google them up. I wish I had more time to break it all down. Fugitive pedagogy as theory and practice. And the key scholars who inform this kind of framework is Jarvis Givens, who I referenced, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, Bell Hooks, W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, James Baldwin, Saidiya Hartman, Fred Moulton, Stefina Harney, and Sylvia Wynter. And these thinkers not only inform, but I give you kind of how they inform, right? Truth telling, theorizing, refusal, and living a break, study and struggle beyond the university, right? If you are in the university, think about it beyond, like how are we engaging with folks who might not have enough time to actually engage in this type of like conversation and thinking and reading, right? And we got to learn from our past scholars like Satima Clark, who helped found the Highlander School after being fired after being a teacher over 20 years in South Carolina because she refused to stop paying her dues to the NAACP. And see, this is the refusal, right? Not only refusal, but it's like, I'm going to make this, and that she believed in it. So I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they're told the truth. We need not to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire, rather to affirm, right? We don't need to reincarnate the indoctrination, unfortunately, a lot of us have experienced about how to view the world and what the world is and the myths of the society in which we are brought into, right? That it's important for us to actually teach the youth to think critically about the world they exist in and ask them what does that mean to them as they're growing up into models and then modeling that through ourselves, right? And that can only happen through these type of conversations, to inquire rather than to affirm. And, literacy is a fugitive practice. This is reading as a refusal of domination. Like, why don't you know what folks is talking about, right? The hidden acts of knowing, right? There's even old texts. But my wife's reading Bahamotep right now, and it's like from 2300 BC. It's one of the oldest wisdom texts, and it talks about certain ideas about how to live life and how to orient yourself. And even that text is old can inform us from lessons that others try to teach others, and that's so important to learn. That's just game peeping game, y'all. Double consciousness, reading the word, but understanding you're reading not just to read and to read a book, right? You're reading to really understand and situate that knowledge for what it means, what's relevant for you and what relevant for right now, right? And it's really deep like that, especially when you're talking about the many multiple facets of way you can situate different types of text through the different lenses to understand it in different ways. Fugitive teaching and historically responsive literacy. Again, it goes back to if you read a primary source that might contradict or make the other primary source much more, and I might be speaking in teacher lingo, please forgive me. But I gotta do that. Literacy as protection and political love, right? And we're in the age of AI, whether we like it or not, right? And we need to understand if our children aren't able to ask the questions needing to be asked, unable to have the background knowledge to make sure that those questions are asked in a historically contextual way, like what questions will be asked? What will be the result of what's fed into it, right? And and literacy has such a key component of that. Because how can you put in something if you don't even know how to read or understand and have a background of reading complex text? You put in garbage, it puts out garbage, right? Imagination as survival, right? Like I said, when you get into an Octavia Butler text, man, just the imagination to just flourish. But it's not just limited, it can be almost any text. And it's working within and against the system, right? Understanding the tools used to how the system's constructed. The only way you can even read the instruction manual is know how to read. And in order to do that, you also need to understand that there is both inside and outside of operating within how these very function. So how do we have conversations to folks who feel like they're outside and the system's against them, right? How do we prioritize folks like in those situations in conversations like this in order to actually engage in some dialogue and introduce some text to get to a deeper conversation? This was some potential strategies: cultural reorientation, unapologetic truth speaking, right? Don't be afraid to speak the truth. It's real interesting how people whisper be like, are you sure you're gonna get, people come up like, I can't believe you said that. No, that's real though. And we're at the point, I would argue, that we got to start saying those things out loud, right? Because you'd be surprised how many people feel the same way. And be realistic. We're engaging in the intellectual warfare, right? When we prioritize the importance of reading, when we prioritize this over simple compliance, right? When we want our children engaged and thinking in classrooms rather than checking off boxes, right? We need to understand that and understand how that classroom orientates itself, how the teacher runs it. If you walk into a high school social studies class, for example, and you see it in straight and rows, right there, that should be a red flag about what real dialogue and conversation and learning is going on in that classroom. And truth be told, we can just ask students at any school and they can tell you which teachers are trash and which ones are doing it right. And the ones that are doing it right, those are the ones that are putting reading and have high expectations and writing in front of those students. And again, maroonage, to come back to this idea, if it doesn't exist in that system, make it exist, but make it exist in a way that you understand that it's not supposed to exist. So, what beliefs, habits, or structures must we release, and what must we protect and grow? We already have everything we need, right? To have folks more literate and caring about society and engaged in it, not just to be a citizen, but to be a full human being, to reflect like that. So how are we growing that? What are we protecting and growing? And what do we need to release? Right? That conceptual incarceration, I truly challenge folks. Again, the Black intellectual tradition reading against the grain, right? Always the refusal to accept state-sanctioned ideas, rejected Western epistemologies that dehumanize Black life, right? Fugitive leaders saw a classroom as a site of resistance, identity building, and spiritual survival. I highlight all this because this also speaks to what this level of work does when you engage in this reading. So obviously folks can't get in with a partner, but I want folks to return to this and ask yourselves, what specific actions can you take in real time right now? How can you center healing and collective care when we're doing this work, right? How can you document and archive this work? Read Plus in Syracuse sounds like it's the type of organization that should be archiving the type of level of work that it's doing, because y'all are the heroes of what should be written about this type of work, right? Practice ethical subversion, right? And it never, of course, hurt anybody or do anything maliciously, but unfortunately, institutions and systems and structures are designed in ways to create barriers. So how do we overcome those barriers in ways that are realistic, pragmatic, and ethical at the same time? Use policy fluency as a shield. And see that can only come from being literate about what policies we're talking about. And obviously teach beneath the surface. And all this is what we do. Self-emancipation as political towards self-determination, mutual aid, fugitive pedagogy. Are we talking about the America, Harriet Tubman, or George Washington? Ask yourself that. Identity derived from a counter narrative, struggling for rights of all people, contrary to the American mythology, exceptionalism, and develop study groups, whether they're formal, informal, whatever. And I'll go back to what I've said previously. It doesn't matter what race or ethnic group, or if you're pink or purple polka dots. We live in a society where these type of things are not taught to us. So if we don't engage it, how do we actually have fully formed opinions and are introduced to the intellectual genealogy that I would argue really informs really any modern real concept about freedom? Because we're talking about people that fought and bled, not just for Black people, but for all people. And so when you're thinking about those ideas that were developed in this society where people weren't supposed to learn about those things, weren't supposed to engage in those ideas, and those ideas in which people developed under those conditions, how can we learn from those lessons to inform how we need to move in a society today that is wants to go back again and create kind of similar conditions when it comes to educating our children around and have them love reading and literacy. And what will happen if we shift the way we think about this, right? Development of a mission. Instead of getting so caught up in measurements, quite frankly, we don't control, we can come up with our way of measuring how we're going to get there. Like, what are the goals and how will we reach it? What purpose? What's the calling? Vital knowledge to skills, character development, a sense of belonging, a striving to want to read, to understand a word and a concept, ability to constrict, critique structures of domination, ability to protect and defend one people's land and culture, an ability to build for eternity. And see, this is like just simply thinking of way we're approaching the way we expect people to engage with literacy. So I'll leave you with the voice, but we do not merely protest. We make renewed demand for freedom in that vast kingdom of the human spirit where freedom has ever had the right to dwell, the expressing of thought to unstuffed ears, the dreaming of dreams by untwisted souls. Such a beautiful quote. Again, if you have the slide, which I go to the beginning, if I need to show the QR code, all these are hyperlinks to different articles, documentary folder, if you want to slowly inch your way into some of the academic stuff, a library folder containing some primary sources, all the Black Panther newspapers, everything really that you can really get started in thinking about these ideas. I want to also uplift in Philadelphia, we'll be reaching 20 years of having a required African American history course in schools. So a community-led group is having a celebration of this and also the 100-year anniversary of Carter G. Woodson's Negro History Week, which again is Black History Month, on February 6th and 7th. All are invited. If you're interested, scan the QR code. It can take you to our email, theblackprint20@gmail.com. And you can reach out to us if you want to learn more information. We also host Africana Studies Network and Lectures series. This is happening at the same time as your current event, but I will definitely share future events because this is the first of many of this year, and all are invited to this. This is meant to be open to everybody across the nation, even other countries, if they want to tune in and really engage in these type of conversations. Again, get to a deeper meaning about how to navigate what we see today. And so I want to thank you. There's my email. Again, another long quote that I'm not going to read off to you, but I strongly suggest you spend the time to read. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Like a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, and I appreciate like you tapping into, our human side, especially with the doll study, which still leaves me in awe and saddened at the same time, to really empowering others to dig in deep and take the time to want to learn. I know when we spoke prior, it was also the Malcolm X book that hooked me in, and just like, okay, I have to read and learn more. And no one asked me to, but I saw the movie, and then I'm like, but I want to know more, and I want to know more about people who look like me, empowering others and working for towards freedom, working towards greater knowledge and really growth so that people of color can grow and prosper, right? And so I can't thank you enough. Like you had me taking notes. I'm over here like taking notes because one thing that really stuck out to me was when you said like menticide and how many times I've been in schools where you're like, hey, did you sign up for band? Do you want to go and join this book club or what have you? And kids are like, no. And you ask them why, and they say because, it's just not the cool thing to do.
And is that apathy or boredom? Or you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
where does that come from? Um, yeah, it's unfortunate. Yeah.
So it makes me think like, does that sense of boredom and lack of interest, is that ingrained that they shouldn't learn and grow and try new things? Is it out of a place of fear? Or is it because of the perpetuation of the achievement gap that you shouldn't want to continue to learn and grow something new? So therefore, I'm not going to engage. So have you seen it in your experience in Philly or with your boys, having four boys just like me, where you've seen people or youth overcome that, right? Because um, people often think that inner city children just want to do less and not more.
Yeah, and numerous times. I remember when I went in teaching, I was like, if I just reach one child in 10 years, and it's like it's actually much, much more than that, right? When we're actually engaging youth in conversations about life. One specific example I can think of is a student who I taught in Kensington, which is considered the opioid capital of America. And I visited a college and I was called up and asked if I would speak to the class. And I was like, can I bring some students and they can engage with your class? And it was a graduate level education policy class. And the students came and at the end of one of the students turned to me and she's like, I never thought I could do this, but I can do this. This isn't nothing. And I was like, of course. I was like, you were like engaging them in ways they weren't even thinking about. And that's the strength and power. And then the high expectation of just reading and writing every day. I even saw reading and writing growth across the board. But this specific student ended up becoming a social worker, is now a social worker at a school in Kensington for youth at risk of dropping out. And that's just meant, and she's first generation, right? That's just one example that I mean, like I love that with because I love her. But there's so many other students that I can point out to. So if any of y'all see this, I'm thinking of y'all too, man. Um, but it speaks to how students need to see it and understand that they're capable. And folks with degrees and all these receipts, it's not that they're smarter, it's that they're taking those times to understand how to navigate those systems. And sometimes it's fear from just being able to engage and get into that.
I agree. When I was the principal of an elementary school, we started going on college visits starting in kindergarten because I'm a believer that you have to see it to be able to dream big and to be able to imagine what the options and possibilities are. But if we just say, you can achieve your dreams, but if you don't know what your options are, you can't dream to even realize what your options are, right? And so you have to have that exposure.
And you just saying that, right? There uh, there uh there isn't any choice when you have no options, right?
Mm.
And sometimes asking our students to choose between Pepsi and Coke sometimes is also disingenuous, and they compete game. They don't know why they compete game, but they do understand, wait, something's off, you know. And that's real also, and that's why in the presentation I did emphasize a lot on that because like we're the adults, we have the responsibility. And sometimes I think we lose sight, of that. And what are we doing to model this for the youth? What are we doing to encourage ourselves to read with one another?
Right. And I appreciate it during your presentation where you share that, anyone can be a teacher, right? And so that's the premise of Syracuse Reads Plus. Like you don't have to have a degree to be a teacher, you know, each one teach one, like, or hopefully a few.
Yep.
And take the time to do a book study, You provided some great resources to start learning about your history. Because in the clip of the video, when the young lady says, I don't know my history, and it made me think of every first day of school. Every year, my boys would bring home the same sheet of paper that says, share your culture, share recipes from your culture, share, you know, annual events from your culture. And so here we are trying to dig deep, like, well, your favorite food is pizza, but that's not our culture, right? And so it's just like, what is our identity? And a lot of people don't realize that as, you know, African Americans or American Blacks, like, we have to really start to dig deep and learn more about our past to be able to really define what our culture is and who we are and who we represent.
Yeah. And just to veg back off of that idea, like that goes back to, are we talking about the America of George Washington? Are we talking about the America of Harriet Tubman, right?
Right,
Are we talking about a vision that envisioned land ownership of other people's land and enslavement in order to make profits? Or do we have a vision from someone who dreamed of freedom for everybody, right? And we can see that whole intellectual genealogy. And again, that's why it's not when I was bringing up like and centering it around the Black intellectual tradition is to bring up the point like that was developed in this society from that, right? When we even talk about modern movements, from gay rights to women's rights, a lot of them modeled what the Black struggle was developing and the arguments even today we see some folks on, conservatives on the right twisting and flipping the tactics and the kind of rhetorical quips of that were used by Black freedom fighters over generations. So it's just a real interesting dynamic when you look at it and look back and look at, oh, like some of these traditions and practices that folks have adopted and used that have been successful and other things that are really just kept from our view and from our understanding from uh, in front of us.
right. But lack of access.
Yeah.
Um, there's so many things. I have so many notes, but not too many. So, you also mentioned one of your quotes was, how are the children? And that also resonated with me,
Yeah.
because the health of your community is based on how well the children are doing, right? And so if our children are struggling to read, write, and comprehend, communicate with others, problem solve, achieve greatness, then that's a sad reflection on our communities. And I want to just keep saying it's just not here in Syracuse, New York, but it is evident across the country. Um, and that reflects our education system, unfortunately. Um, so, what would you suggest as our final thought to have collective liberation to make our communities more healthy? What would you suggest to our average community people who just love their community? They don't have an education background, but they want to make a difference. What would you suggest to them?
I would say set up them study groups with one another. That's definitely like baby steps right away. That can start off with like an article or folks sharing articles with one another. I'm not talking about spamming emails, y'all. There's a couple folks that do that to me, but I am thankful though for the article shared. But also think of ways to kind of engage in this history, like understand like what we see right now, right? And our elders know this for a fact, right? Just didn't happen.
Right,
But for a lot of our youth, right, that is what it seems like a lot of the time is how it's presented, right? If things are shown, it's on black and white and very distant. And folks, those intergenerational conversations should be sought out, prioritized at times if possible, especially around, complex things
mhm,
uh, that the larger, you know, city or society or group of folks are dealing with. Um, But I would say those are just first beginning steps. Of course, be vigilant, volunteer at your local school if you can. Get in there, see what's happening. Believe me, you'll figure out within a week about where learning is going on and where's learning not, which is also another issue, right? And never forget that some of the best educators I know did not have a receipt, and some of the worst educators I ever met had several of them. So whatever that's worth, um, that's the thing you need to remember, that like just because people got receipts behind their names don't mean that folks are unable to engage it on that level. I always used to say to my students, when I was like, you know what indoctrination is? And they're like, oh, I don't know what that means. I was like, it's just a fancy word to say brainwashing.
Mm,
Now, you don't go around saying you brainwashing people because people look at you like, what, you look a little crazy. But if you say indoctrination, it comes to a deeper nuance that like, yeah, you know what I mean?
mhm.
And just those small examples are real, man. And students love that when you can hit them off with something like that. Or have them ask their mom and dad, do you know who Carter G. Woodson is? The
Right.
father, run that down. Students just, those type of things are real.
Well, I appreciate you. I'm going to just before you jump off, I'm just going to share my last little tidbit. Um, so we thank everyone who took the time to view and to hear our guest speaker for this evening, Mr. Jimenez. I really appreciate you. And before everyone leaves, I always like to leave everyone with ways to improve literacy for yourself, for your neighbors, for your children, and it starts with access to diverse and engaging reading materials, just like you were saying, and encourage regular reading habits, both at home, in school, wherever you are, at church, at a community group, wherever you are on this beautiful earth. Make sure to remind one another to pick up a book, an article, something, and read. And I appreciate you saying um, to find the counter to whatever you're reading. So if this person is saying one side, what does the other side or the other three sides say, to really have a true box of knowledge? So read daily. If you have young people, read out loud. The reason for reading out loud is if they make a mistake, you can take the time to correct that so they don't practice the same mistakes. Write regularly in response to what you're reading. So, as a family, you could read together, you could journal together, you could just write notes to each other. Again, look at that and see if it mimics proper sentence structure or paragraph structure. Use resources like your local libraries, online reading programs, create a book club, create your own local program. You can come to Syracuse Reads Plus and we will teach you the science of reading, including phonics instruction, and set goals for yourself. Like Mr. Jimenez is saying, like set a small goal and achieve your reading goal and celebrate that. So if you can't start at 30 minutes, start at 10 or 15 minutes while making the bigger goal for yourself of reading more. You'll be surprised. The more that you read and grow, that brain will love it and you'll want to read even more.
Mhm.
So remember, our goal as a community is to read great by 2028. We also have our second annual literacy kickoff this year. It is October 18th at the Hillside Work and Scholarship Center here in Syracuse, at the corner of Salt Springs and East Ave. And we will have our keynote speaker is Kareem Weaver of the documentary The Right to Read. So if you're able to see this, make sure that you join us for that joyous occasion where the community comes together to talk about literacy and how we all can take a piece of the pie. Like just take one child at a time to make sure that you help someone grow, or adult at a time to help someone learn and grow. So I also thank you. This QR code takes you to our Facebook page. I also thank Believe in Syracuse for their financial and fiscal support of Syracuse Reads Plus, along with the Community Foundation of Syracuse. So again, I am Dr. Ellen White from Syracuse Reads Plus, also the president of Believe in Syracuse. And I thank you for joining us this evening. I thank you for making a positive impact on our community and our world. And I thank you, Mr. Jimenez, for joining us and really dropping so many jewels and so much knowledge on us today. I can't thank you enough.
Thank you.
Thank you and have a good night.
You too.